Welcome to your watercolour class. I'm just going to run through some of the requirements that you may need. These requirements are just a list of ideas of what you could bring along. Please don't rush out and buy everything, but you'll get an idea of what will be used in classes. So the first item is a watercolour container, can be a glass jar. I'm not precious about what you have. This one's particularly good because it has the 3 segments for your primary colours and somewhere to put other, if I use gouache or anything, I would actually leave it in the middle so that it doesn't contaminate the other colours. A glass jar will do. I'm not worried about what you actually bring. It's just an idea. So the next item is an old toothbrush. You've got these around the house. These are articles that you may have in the house. A water spray bottle, that's just an ordinary water spray bottle, and I have a very, very fine one as well. This little fine one is from a mouthwash, so it's super, super fine, so that's very handy. Dishwashing detergent, that's just simple dishwashing detergent in a bottle. Just put in there, no water, and I'll explain how to use that later. So that's dishwashing detergent. Desk cover, I've got blueies that are available from chemists, or the larger one under here is a puppy mat. They're from the $2 shops, which are much more reasonable in price. Supermarkets have them too. Pencils, I'm mainly using HB pencil. I'll explain pencils later too, why I use a HB. And also I do have a group of metallics. I have a gold, silver and white and bronze in that. And I also have these, which I use a fair amount of time, which is a Uniball fine, and it's a waterproof pen. So they're basically what I would need. Napkins, paper napkins, I get those from the supermarket when I'm shopping. Just a group of cheap napkins and boards. This board I'm using is a corflute board. I do have a supply of those, so there's a couple of boxes. And so while we can use them, that's what I've got at the moment. So I'm just going to move that away. Okay, this is an A3, no, it's a board for an A4 paper. The larger one underneath is a canvas that you could use, but they're a lot heavier. I'll get that out later and show you that. So materials that you would have to buy from a art shop, and the tape that I'm using is a high stick 821, but I get that sent because it's a specialised tape, so I do have that sent to me. Tracing paper. Now tracing paper is up to you. If you're a competent drawer, then I do encourage everybody to draw. Most people in classes do draw, but if you're terrified, I'd rather you do a tracing rather than sit there and be fearful of doing a class. Canson 50 to 55 GSM is the most transparent, and that's available from art shops. Plastic palette knife, and I have a metal palette knife. So that's the metal one. And I also have a plastic one. They come in sets, and that's a crook shank. That's necessary for some of the work that I do in class. Art masking fluid. I've got Winsor & Newton masking fluid, and that comes with yellow in the bottom of it, and that's to be shaken before use, but we'll go through that process. And it's not clear, okay? There's a white one that's clear, and that is really hard to use on white paper, so I recommend you don't buy that. And there's a permanent one too, that once it's on, it never comes off. So to do with the masking fluid, there should be a crepe rubber. That's the remover for the masking fluid. So you would need a crepe rubber. You can use your fingers, but it is very hard if you actually hurt your fingernails by rubbing it off. Soft rubber, which is a Creta rubber. Mine's a Creta, but it doesn't look like it because I have different brands. But it's definitely the best rubber for paper. It's the most softest, beautiful rubbers that you can get. They're available from Creta is a monolith brand, but of course we found them in other brands. Okay, so I'm working on Arches 300 GSM A3 pad paper. And the reason I'm doing that is that the pad paper can be cut in half. Okay, so that is the A3, but cut in half you've got two A4s. In studio work, we're really only working on A3s for the reason that we need the space between each other now, seeing as we're separated and we're not in the studio again yet, but hopefully later on we will be, but we'll be working on A3. And so this is Arches 300 GSM. It says cold pressed, okay, so cold press would either be rough or medium, but this says fin, which is, I think these come from Paris, so that fin is fine, and that's a green label. And this would be the most durable paper. If you only want to get one pad, I'd get that pad of paper. The next one is the Arches Rough, and fortunately they put rough on this one, which makes it easier to tell the difference between the pads. And that's the rough surface. And this one here is the hot press. So as soon as you see hot pressed, you'll learn that that's smooth paper. It's a different process to make the paper, but that's your smooth paper. So the only other thing that you would need is maybe a cheap A4 pad for doing some exercises and practice some of the painting techniques. Okay, we'll move on to brushes. And so we have the 1 inch square shader. That's an Art Basics. That's black, but that's the other one now that I didn't have one for a while, so I bought another one of the Art Basics. That's a 1/2 inch. I've got a very, very tiny sable pointer. I've got a size, can't read it, size 6 I think, in an Escoda sable. Okay, now these are the Escoda brushes. There's a 6 and an 8 in those, and that's my favourite 12. That's one of my favourite brushes. Then we've got the Recab 900 series, and the difference between these is sable is for soft work and delicate work on smooth paper. You can do it on rough and medium as well, but it's a much softer brush. The most durable brushes are the synthetics, and then you've got the Recab, which is half synthetic and half hair. So it holds more water than those. So I use that equally as these. And then this is a sable Raphael, and that they don't usually come in sable anymore. It's probably squirrel or something like that. Then you've got your liners or riggers. You've got a fine one and a larger one, and I just get those from any sort of shop I can find them and look at the size of them. That's the only way I sort of buy those. These are only available from probably Parker's in Sydney and Seniors in Victoria, Seniors Art Supply. That's a nib and holder. It's a Hunt Speedball 513EF nib, and that's basically got a very, very small point on the end of it, and it runs very, very well on paper. That's why that particular nib. And then we've got a hake brush, a 2 inch hake. Now, if I actually looked at this and thought, what do I need? If I had that, you probably need one of those. If I had 1 or 2 of those, if I had those, I could probably do without that. I could live without that. And if I had those, and they were the only brushes I owned, I'd still be very happy. I wouldn't be too worried. So just know that you don't have to rush out and buy everything you see. It's a guide for future. It's taken a lot of years to get this kit together of painting equipment, so don't think that I expect you to have everything in that kit to start with. Moving on to watercolour paints. The one request I've got is that you don't buy Cotterman paints, which are school paints, or any other brand that's a student paint instead of an artist quality paint. It's a very disappointing artwork when you've got cheap paints and cheap paper. So give yourself the best chance that you can by having really good products, because you don't have to have a lot of them. It's just better to have good quality. So the first colour I'm going to talk about is Windsor Yellow, okay, and then we've got Windsor Red, and then we've got Cobalt Blue. Now that's a primary palette. So primary colours can make a lot of colours out of primary, and so it's not necessary to have hundreds of paints. The other part of the primary palette I'm going to talk about is Raw Sienna, Rose Madder and Phthalo. It's very difficult to make phthalo out of these, but phthalo is a fantastic colour. And so that's another side of a primary palette. And then we've got Lamp Black. Now Lamp Black is the colour that makes these colours in a darker value, but they still remain the same colour. If you used another paint, like Payne's Grey or something, it would change the hue and that would go green. Whereas if you add Lamp Black, it should stay a darker yellow. So the other thing that you can use then is Gum Arabic, and that's the product that can lighten your paints without adding water. So that's something that you can actually make a very, very light red by adding Gum Arabic and not water. The only thing is, if you use too much Gum Arabic, it'll shine on your paper, but it's possible to use that. So that would be the absolute basics of colours, and from there it's up to you. You might have colours that you like. I don't tell students that they've got to use my colours. It's only a suggestion. Payne's Grey in AS is important because it runs beautifully, whereas Winsor & Newton Lamp Black, no, that's the Payne's Grey. The Payne's Grey is the one that runs beautifully, but I haven't put it in the primary palette because it's in another section of the full palette, which I'll go to now. So I'll just put these aside and move the camera back up so we've got more room, and open up my palette. So this is my palette. Okay, so I'll just go through the palette with you so that you can see exactly what's there. I'll move that in a bit closer. So on the palette you've got Windsor Yellow. You've then got Raw Sienna. I've then got a hot pink, which I love, but it's not necessary. Rose Madder. Then I've got Alizarin Crimson, which is here. Don't worry about the rest of those. Windsor Red, Burnt Sienna, Cobalt Turquoise, okay, that's Cobalt Blue. So I've got two. That's a large Cobalt Blue, that's a small Cobalt Blue. French Ultramarine, which must be hiding. French Ultramarine is there, and then Indethrin is the darkest blue that I've got. Now it's important to note that you can have any other colours you like, whatever. I've got Phthalo in here, I've got Payne's Grey in up here, I've got Australian Red Gold, that's another favourite of mine, Australian Red Gold, and I can't do without Payne's Grey, as I said, and Lamp Black is to make your colours darker. Okay, so that's stuck. In the rain, all the paints become wet again. So because it's raining, we've got wet paints. Okay, this paint is a complex palette, okay? A palette that's first used that only has the primaries on it, it's a very, very basic palette, and you get that end result. But once you get going with your palette and you've got colours here that you've got mixed, and you can put your brush in there and get some of those other colours, that will actually then show that the painting has progressed to a more complex colour scheme, which is much more visually attractive. The palette there also has my greens. I don't buy green, except that one is in this palette because this palette is a transparent palette. That's important to me because there's no colours here that... Raw Sienna could be a little bit semi-opaque. If you get a colour chart for the paints, they'll be able to tell you who's opaque and who's not. And this particular is the green palette here. We've got Windsor Yellow, French Ultramarine and Indethrin. And that makes light green, medium green, dark green. Over here I've got Burnt Sienna and I've got French Ultramarine and Indethrin. And so they make a brown grey, a blue grey, a darker grey, and then when I mix them together completely, I get black. And so that's the strongest part of my palette. I've also got Windsor Purple Diazirin just because I like it. And so that's my full palette. Now, before I left the gallery that I was working at, that was my palette. That's before COVID. I'm going to turn it around. It's upside down to me. But that was my palette that I was using. And so this one here for Zoom and for online classes is a little bit less. The size of it's not as big, but I travel with this overseas. Put it in a plastic bag, in a clip-lock bag, in the bottom of my luggage with my board. And then that's fantastic that it doesn't break. It's metal. It can be held by the hand as well. You can lift that up and put your hand in there. I don't do that because it's backwards to me. Okay. In class you'll also receive a copy of the brushes, the palette. This is the palette that's underneath here that's been drawn. And so that'll tell you exactly what those colours are if you want to set it up the same, but that's up to you. And as I said, I started out with a round plastic plate with the primaries set out on the actual palette and put other colours between, put my darks in the middle, and I did years of working with just a plastic plate. And through the time you'll change, I'll find another palette that I like. So any sort of palette, but something to put your paints on is necessary. This will show the idea of what happens with paint. With hot pressed, the paint sits on there. Now, if you actually just put a brush mark on a piece of smooth paper, it stays there. So the idea is that smooth paper is basically, unless you use a wash, is actually damp before you put your paint on. Otherwise it just grabs and that's all you get. It doesn't very easily cauliflower. Cold pressed paper, medium, is the one where it sits just in those little troughs and you'll get some sort of a pattern on your paper, not a great deal. It's the most durable paper and the best paper for anybody. If you didn't have either of the two, then that's the one to have. The cold pressed rough has much deeper divots in it so that the paint will sit in those wells and will give you some sort of a pattern in your paint. Moving on now to your paper. Okay, so watercolour paper, as we said, hot press smooth, cold press medium, cold press rough. Your paper, this is a sheet of medium paper. Your paper selection will depend on the subject to be painted. I generally tell the students a week before, and when we change over to an artwork, what sort of paper that they'll be using. In Zoom, I send out emails with the requirements on it. Hot press paper is smooth and very easily to mark with smudges or fingerprints. It also absorbs water quickly than the other papers, along with colour. Smoothing dark colours can take a lot more effort on smooth paper. Masking tape is not used on smooth paper. It may actually go into the paper and not be able to be removed. And also your crepe rubber would actually mark the paper as well, so it's just not usable. You can use 600 paper, but I don't like 600. It's a bit like painting on cardboard. Okay, we go to cold press medium. It's very versatile when painted. It has a textile fabric look to it. Watercolours that you want to create texture with the paint work well on that surface. 300 GSM is very economical, and in the pad paper that we're using at the moment. If you are not wanting to afford a pad of paper, you can also buy Archer's sheet paper. that should be stretched before you use it. I don't think I have any stretching tape here at home. I think it's still at the studio. So you'll be shown how to stretch paper as well. Cold press rough paper is very versatile. It's a rough surface. It's great for textures, for painting landscapes. Palette knife painting is wonderful. Masking fluid is used on both medium and rough paper. It's easily removed as well because of the texture on it. Okay, so what I do is select the best type of paper for the work that we're going to be doing. Talking about pencil selection, I'm working with HB pencils for the fine reason that the Bs will make smudges on your paper and be very hard to remove with your rubber and make black marks on your paper. The H's become harder, and the hardness of the pencil can score your paper. So even if you rub it out, you can be left with a halo of where you actually drew. So that to me means that the HB is a much easier pencil to use, and will be removed very easily with your rubber without too much trouble, and the rubber won't sort of mark the paper either. And we're moving on to cutting paper. Okay, so a sheet of medium paper, and I actually will take the camera back out. Okay, so it's folded in half. This is for A4s, that is. And hold it there and just tweak the corner. Hold it in the next corner, tweak it, and that will be the mark that I'll use. It's hard to see in the light where that mark is. And with a ruler, I'll actually rule that line. Now, if you choose to rip it with a ruler, you'll get a rough edge. If you choose to actually fold your paper, that cockles the paper and does something really bad to the paper. It gets a bend before you actually get the cut. And so then with scissors, hope these are good scissors, got some bad ones around, that's cut. Okay, so that's how I actually do cut my paper. If you want a rough edge on a paper, you'd have to have a full sheet. You'd end up with nothing much if you did a rough edge on this, unless you wanted a lot smaller. And that's why I'm using the boards black at the moment. I've changed, and every board I own, I will spray to be black, because I found at this time, if I'm putting that down on white paper, it's very hard to see. But if I put it on the black board, it's much easier to see. And not only that, it's easy to see when the tape goes on as well. So the tape edge has got a turn on it, so I can always pick it up. And that then is placed on the paper, and I can see through it. So straight away, I can see how much paper I'm losing. And it's such a good tape that I don't have to lose a lot of paper in taping it. I've seen people try to paint with stretching tape on their work. Stretching tape is glued, and therefore when you wet your paper, it'll rise. It'll come off the board. So it's taped down with masking tape, and that look through it. When it was white, I couldn't see that. I could not see how much I was actually losing. And so the reason that's done that way is that when I'm finished, I come round the one way. I don't change direction. It's a bit wider. Don't tape it down hard there. Lift that one. Lift this other one, if I can get it. Put that one down and fold that one over. Now I've got a tab to lift that off. I've got a tab here that I can lift it straight off. One of my pet hates is tape going over a board and round the other side. I find students scratching for ages trying to get their tape off. And that then, I'll take that bit off actually, just so that that doesn't happen. And that's ready to be painted. Okay, so there's a board here that has a little bit of something. I should have probably drawn something on there to start with. So I'll do a little bit better in that. just draw out from behind there. If I do a straight edge, I'll show you that that's the only place that you can turn something over, is to have a straight edge. There's a couple of things that I insist on, is when you paint that, you paint the whole petal, and then you do the turnover later. Because what happens is people paint up to the actual turnover and then try and paint that, and there's always a gap in their paint. But I always start with the lightest value, being a watercolourist, and go to my darks after that. So you'll find watercolour is the opposite to oils and acrylics. So that's shaken until the yellow comes out of the bottom of the masking fluid. I do have an egg cup that I use to put it in. And always clean the top of the jar. There's a little bit of something there on the jar at the moment. And you find if you leave that, the whole bottle will go off and you'll lose the whole lot. Just getting a tissue, maybe several tissues, and wipe that off to start with. And I'll get something to run it down. So if you run that down the pencil, it goes straight into the actual egg cup. And the lid's cleaned. You may find that there may be some in the lid as well, and that will go off as well. So I'll just make sure that gets cleaned. Just a tissue in there and clean it out. And put the lid back on. These lids can be a bit of a problem. So myself, they get masking fluid stuck in them, and then you can't get the lid off them. We've had a few that we've struggled with. And so what I do is keep my AS bottles, and I actually transfer them into that as I'm using them. I've kept this one special because I'm doing a special artwork at the moment that needs to be really, really fresh. So I won't put it into that until I've finished. But I keep it in a glass bottle rather than this with the cap that won't come off. Okay, so it's in there. You need a brush, and this brush has been used for years for masking fluid. And your detergent, that brush cannot be wet. You can't use it, wash it and decide to come back and do more. That won't work. And so the detergent goes onto the actual brush, and it's got quite a bit on there right through the brush. I'll leave it with it dripping off it because it's quite thick, so it's going to stay there. Get the lid back on that. And then go through a tissue and just roll it through the tissue just to get the excess off the outside edge. Now I'll zoom the camera in so you can see that more clearly. So now you can see the actual part that I'm actually putting it on. And so then that goes on, and I don't touch the paper. I let the brush glide across the paper. And it will have bubbles, but that's all right. You know you can get those out later. And I'm not touching the paper. I'm not scratching the paper. I'm not thinning the masking fluid out to the point that it disappears. And that goes on. And it's fairly thick because it's easy to get off. When it's thick, when it's thin, it's really hard to get off. Okay, so that's that one. This one. If I don't go over the pencil, paint, when you paint over that pencil, will be trapped under it. So it's a good idea sometimes to put the colour underneath that you want and then draw up that spot that's there. That would come off with a tissue. You could just lift that up. I quite often do sections with this and speckle it onto work as well. I just should stay away from that one. No, I'll do it now. I'll do another demonstration of painting this up later when the masking fluid's dry. Now the bubbles will have to be burst, and the bubbles don't appear always because of what you've actually when you shook the bottle, they can appear because the little pattern in the paper will hold air bubbles. And when they decide to, they'll just burst. And that will cause air bubbles. So it's a good idea to put your masking fluid on very well, because when you finish, that's what you've got to paint. So if you hurry with the masking fluid and put it everywhere, then you've got a difficult job later. I'll just speckle some on here just for the sake of it, just on the paper, just to put something on there to show that you can actually do that as well. Okay, so that's how the masking fluid is actually put on. You can't keep that. You can't put it back in the jar. I'll put this back up. There's no way you're going to keep that because it's going to go back into the jar and ruin the jar. This is going into the water and just washed. So once you've done a few and you find that your brush is completely stiff and can't be revived, then you need to use Dissolve It that's available at Bunnings. Maybe in some hardwares now, supermarkets, I'm not sure, but I do get it from Bunnings. And that's the thing that will take the rubber, which is a product that sticks in your brush and you can't get it out, but that's survived for many years by being cleaned when it's not clean. The other thing I do have is hydro sort of sponge that I get from Super Cheap Auto. Little bits and pieces, so whatever you can find around the house. I do have a pipette here for water when I'm actually using washes of colour, and we'll learn all about those as we paint. There's a lot that we can learn on the way, and what you'll find is that you'll come into a group and there'll be painters that have been there for 10, maybe 15 years or more, and you'll be disheartened thinking that you can't cope with, being a beginner in that environment. But that's fine because everybody starts somewhere. We're very, very patient. I'm very helpful. But that initial coming into a studio environment, this video is meant to help you to actually do that transition between the two classes. Okay, so I hope this has been very helpful, and I will see you in the studio.